sheriff's horse around, and with a hand as big as a ham, let go a resounding thwack across the beast's flank.
Okay, let's restart. I forgot to put the caster on. So, alright, we're back. We have a new schedule for June. We're starting at 11 Finnish time, and probably I'll be doing on a couple of days a week. We'll see about Sundays yet. I'll be continuing listening to the book we had on last time, Tin Horns and Calico. It's a pretty interesting one. Yeah. I think I can start right now. Only have to check the chat if it's showing up. Okay. Let's see the program, but let's see it over. There we go. Get to refresh that from time to time. Anyway, let's set the book up.
Section 3 of Tin Horns and Calico by Henry Christman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Seward Takes the Helderbergs. Early in October, Sheriff Archer let himself be talked into invading the Helderbergs in person. 3 deputies accompanied him, the whole party traveling on horseback. Before they were halfway up the autumn-draped hills, they heard the tin horns, and at Reedsville, on the crest, they found the narrow, twisting road blocked by a wall of determined men. Archer spurred his horse toward them, but a broad-beamed farmer caught the reins, yanked the sheriff's horse around, and with a hand as big as a ham, let go a resounding thwack across the beast's flank. The horse reared and bolted down the road toward Albany. The deputies followed close behind their leader, with the contemptuous yells of the crowd rolling after them. For the next few weeks, Stephen Van Rensselaer left the tenants alone, as disturbing political developments had cooled his enthusiasm for an immediate showdown. In the past, his family had experienced little difficulty in electing friends who would protect landlord interests in the state legislature. But now, in making their nominations, both parties had their eyes on the Helderbergs. Not only Van Rensselaer, but conservatives of both parties had passed many an anxious moment since the inauguration of Governor William H. Seward, the young man from Auburn, with the offhand manner, twinkling eyes, and unruly hair. Bred in the ideals of Jefferson, Seward had deserted the Democratic Party early in his career because he felt it had traveled too far from the doctrines of its founder. Now he had come to power in a conservative party by openly advocating that it cut its ties with the aristocracy and become the party of the people. Whig policy in New York State had once been dictated by men like Samuel Stevens, a Van Rensselaer lawyer who had opposed Seward's nomination, and Daniel Dewey Barnard, the good patroon's executor, who declared that the tenants should consider it an honor to carry tribute to the patroon. Now it was in the hands of a man who talked to everybody and listened not only to plain-spoken liberals but also to theorizing politicians. Seward's public policy required that he restore political power to the people and open to all men of whatever race, Negro or white, all paths for the improvement of their condition as well as for their mental and moral culture. He promised schools in the conviction that self-government could be maintained only by an educated and enlightened people. He would welcome the immigrant, share with him political and religious freedom, tolerate his churches, establish schools for his children, and so assimilate his habits, his manners, and his opinions. In the marble halls of the defeated Democrats, the derision that greeted this kind of talk was tinged with anxiety. The more conservative Whigs, too, watched with misgivings as the political theorists took the winding path under the horse chestnuts and pines to the governor's study. Chief among the visitors was Thurlow Weed, editor of the Albany Evening Journal and rising party boss, known to his Whig intimates as the Dictator. Slumped in a chair with his long legs stretched toward the fire, Weed would talk politics by the hour while the two men puffed heavy cigar smoke in each other's faces. He often brought with him young Horace Greeley, then only 28, who had come to Albany to edit the Jeffersonian during the campaign of 1838. The governor liked this slender, light-haired young man with the stoop and the nearsighted eyes. He thought Greeley rather unmindful of the forms and social usages, and yet singularly clear, original, and decided in his political views. These men were very conscious of developments in the Helderbergs. They had the farmers in mind when they selected boisterous old General Erastus Root of Delhi, Delaware County, as one of the 3 senatorial candidates in the Albany district. Root was a former Democrat, champion of the defunct Working Man's Party, and long a bitter opponent of the landlord aristocracy. However, the Democrats, old hands at political generalship, had nominated Hugh Scott and Charles Boughton for the Assembly, hoping that the tenants' enthusiasm for these 2 members of the Anti-Rent Committee would win votes for the other Democratic candidates and offset the new Whig liberalism. Only by a miracle, it would seem, could the Whigs break the Democrats' 22-year control of the Senate, the traditional stronghold of conservatism in the state. At the last minute, Thurlow Weed performed the miracle. He sent word to influential Whigs in New York City, emphasizing the gravity of the situation, and they promptly chartered a steamer for a hurried trip upriver. They arrived in Albany on the Sunday morning before election and sent for Weed to meet them at the Eagle Tavern, where they were later joined by Governor Seward. The men from New York City opened a trunk and took out a large bandana handkerchief full of banknotes of various denominations, amounting to $8,000, which they placed at Weed's disposal, charging him to spare no effort to carry the district. If any more were needed, they would draw checks for it. The politician told them it would be impossible to disburse such a large sum in the 2 days left before election, but he took $3,000, sending half to Columbia, Greene, Delaware, and Rensselaer counties, and reserving the rest for Albany. Governor Seward offered no objection, although he had pledged himself to purify the ballot box, but he was seriously concerned lest they be discovered. A strange ship in port and a party of strangers at the Eagle might, he pointed out, arouse the curiosity of the Democratic Argus. Again, Thurlow Weed proved himself a master strategist. One of his henchmen went for a stroll along the docks with a printer who worked for the Argus, and not only pointed out the strange ship, but volunteered to find out what it was doing in Albany. So it was that the next morning, on information thoughtfully supplied by the Whigs, the Argus reported the arrival of a group of flower speculators who, having private information of bad crops in Europe, were seeking to secure a domestic monopoly. Meanwhile, Weed's men, their pockets weighted with emergency funds, were rounding up all the Whig steamboat and sloop hands on the Hudson to swing around the poles and ascertain where the screws were loose and the machinery needed oiling. The plot succeeded. Weed out-regencied the Albany Regency and won the 3 contested seats. Thus, said Weed blandly, a memorable coup d'etat, completely revolutionizing the Senate, was effected on the very edge of election by the thoughtfulness and liberality of a few zealous politicians. As events were to prove, he and his generous friends had bought more than a Whig victory. They had purchased Senate seats for two future anti-rent champions, General Root and Mitchell Sanford. The election was a double defeat for Stephen IV. He could no longer count on the Senate as a defender of vested rights, and the electioneering period had given the tenants time to organize and to entertain notions of legislative redress. He was convinced he could win if the state itself would assist in rent collection, but he had no reason to look to Governor Seward for that kind of support that John Jay had once given to the Livingstons. Seward's lack of sympathy for the landed aristocracy was a matter of record. There was, however, one way of enlisting his aid: to convince him that armed insurrection was threatening the peace of the state. It was on this premise that Van Rensselaer planned more drastic action for Sheriff Archer. Notices were issued by the sheriff's office on the morning of Monday, December 2nd, 1839, ordering 700 citizens of Albany to appear at once as a posse to put down the rebellion in the Helderbergs. Meanwhile, sensational stories of violence on the hilltop were circulated in an effort to rouse the population. Van Rensselaer tried to justify himself by addressing a 2-column letter to the public, which appeared in the press of that day. Of his counter-proposals to the Tenants' Committee, he wrote, "I am well informed that many would have availed themselves of my proposition if they had not been deterred by threats of violence to their person and property." Neither his unconvincing version of events since his father's death, nor the rumors of further tenant uprisings, had much effect on the laborers who were to compose the bulk of the posse. The response was only half-hearted. In a lampoon of the day's events, the Albany Microscope solemnly described that morning as follows: "Our citizens were startled from their propriety by the call upon them of our indefatigable and efficient constables in all the agitation of a thief race, terror and importance blazing in their sagacious countenances, each carrying a handful of papers of most ominous appearance, being the size and shape to offenders known as warrants, subpoenas, etc., etc., at which all goodly disposed people have such an instinctive dread, and when, with the vision of grand juries, indictments, fines, and other commonplace pains and penalties full in their minds, the reader can better judge than we can describe their utter astonishment at receiving a sheriff's mandate to turn out to war, and that too with a hereof fail not at your peril. Here was a sight to behold. The Dutch had taken the Halibarrack. War, pestilence, and famine inevitable. Good God, what was to be done? Some took salts, some turned pale, got the diarrhea, and sent for the doctor, and some went to lawyers to know if there was no getting off. Some went to ministers to ask for prayers, and some went to bed. Throughout, the day was one of excitement. The Irish invoked St. Patrick, and the Dutch cried, "To de Blixen en Duivel, mid your posse comitatus," while the Yankee reckoned it a bad spec and that he shouldn't engage in't. At one time, stated the Microscope, the rumor was that the farmers had bought all the powder in town. At another, that the women were all armed with great chopping knives, all bloody and gashy, forming an impregnable body to all invaders. At another, that they had blown up all the bridges, poisoned all the streams, murdered all their children and old folks to have them out of the way, and had sworn to eat nothing but the flesh of their enemies all this winter. By mid-morning that Monday, 500 had responded to the sheriff's summons. According to Frederick Seward, the governor's son, great was the excitement and much the merriment in the crowd that gathered round, either in obedience to Archer's call or from curiosity. The hilarity increased when Archer came out on the sidewalk in front of City Hall and began to call the roll, for it included such prominent people as bank presidents, former Governor William Marcy, John Van Buren, the handsome son of the president, the patroon's lawyers, and Stephen IV himself. Stephen was excused from service. But Marcy and Van Buren frowned down the whoops of the crowd and marched away with the army of men, on foot, on horseback, in wagons and carriages. Marcy, a grim-faced man of 53, wearing a big hat that seemed to float on his shaggy hair, marched as far as Adams's Tavern, some 6 miles away, before a friend picked him up in a carriage and drove him the rest of the way. It was late afternoon when the posse reached Clarksville under the mountain. Although Archer had received word that a large body of men was assembled at Reedsville on the crest, he went forward to meet them with only 100 mounted men, leaving the rest behind at Clarksville. The picked company had barely begun the steep climb above Clarksville when they found their way blocked by an equal number of mounted farmers, who parted ranks without resistance, and then fell in behind as Archer led his men on up the hill. Less than a mile away, another blockade of farmers was encountered. "Make way," Archer shouted. The farmers stood motionless, while insistent blasts of horns echoed from the rocks above. Archer fell back to consult with his men, and they were girding for action when, to their astonishment, the second blockade divided and let them pass. As soon as the sheriff's company reached Reedsville, the farmers' plan suddenly became apparent. They had maneuvered the sheriff into a position where 600 men blocked his rear, and 3 times as many now barred the road ahead, all mounted, all armed with pitchforks and clubs. Archer rushed the line with a few of his men, but the farmers pressed them back. A second assault was repulsed with even stronger opposition. After a brief conference with his lieutenants, the sheriff ordered a retreat. The farmers' rear guard opened a pathway, the posse galloped through, and the farmers trailed them down the mountain with an avalanche of derision. At Clarksville, instead of ordering his entire army to attack, Archer directed them to return to Albany. He himself hurried on ahead to make his report. His straggling army suffered casualties that day, but only from a protracted assault on the bar and commissary at Clark's Tavern. The rumor was that former Governor Marcy tore his breeches and had to spend the night at the tavern to have a patch put in. John Van Buren, the handsome young widower, was said to have stayed overnight, but most of the posse went home at some time before morning. Of this phase the microscope reported, "The homeward march of the victorious, covered with glory, spoils, and grease, was a sight to behold. The line of march extended nearly 16 miles. The squads that first commenced the advance backwards arrived at about 2 in the morning, and they made the streets echo with their notes of triumph. The remainder, among whom were several who had been desperately wounded in the melee and left for dead, but who had strangely recovered, came straggling in at their leisure until sunset. A few who had given out on the road and had been observed lying in the corners of the fences in a happy state of wounded unconsciousness came limping in late in the evening. This is an unparalleled case, and will immortalize the revolt of the Helderberg and the march and deeds of the Grand Army to all posterity." Although it was nearly midnight when he reached Albany, Sheriff Archer went at once to Governor Seward and asked for the state militia. He made his desultory efforts of the past 4 months sound like major battles, and though he had not brought the whole posse into action that afternoon, he told the governor that his entire force had been inadequate to overcome the resistance. Seward's skepticism was undisguised. He had already had reports of the day's expedition and the debauch of the main contingent at Clarksville. He had Sheriff Archer file a sworn, explicit report of all attempts to serve papers on the recalcitrant tenants. After reading the documents, which included a carefully edited account of the posse's march, the governor was convinced that there had been some violence, but there was no evidence that the county had fully used its powers to effect a settlement. The law required him to give military aid to any county that needed it to enforce law and order, but he would not appeal to the last argument of kings until the legal resort of republics had been exhausted. Seward was in a difficult position, but the pressure was too strong to ignore. After a lengthy conference with his advisors, he ordered Archer to get warrants for the arrest of farmers who had resisted him or his deputies in the exercise of their duty. The sheriff was then to summon the Albany County militia to ensure order while he made the arrests. If there should be any resistance this time, the governor's instructions read, he was to seize the person resisting and repel force by force, being careful to avoid the destruction of life. Seward made it clear that the troops were to be used only in arresting persons who were charged with having resisted in the past, not for the purpose of collecting rents. This distinction satisfied the governor and his aides, but not the tenants of the West Manor. A military invasion was a military invasion. Besides, their 4th of July vow still held, and the arrest of a single anti-renter might seriously damage the movement. Hastily, the farmers assembled at Reedsville, equipped with every kind of makeshift weapon. At the top of the mountain road, they rolled into position 2 hoary old field pieces that had done service in the Revolution. Accompanied by the militia as an armed guard, Archer marched again on Monday, December 9th, in a blustery winter storm. Again, Albany bristled with rumors. One report had it that 2,000 farmers were at Reedsville, prepared to resist or die. Another said Archer's army was hemmed in without shelter, drenched by swirling rain. At 2 a.m., a messenger arrived at the governor's mansion with a special dispatch from Major William Bloodgood, commander of the military. The farmers had neither fired nor offered any resistance, but by occupying all the available accommodations for the night, they had kept the troops from gaining a foothold on the mountaintop, thus winning the first engagement. The major regretted to report that his men had been forced to fall back to Clarksville, and he besought the governor to rush him an immediate supply of tents, provisions, and blankets. No resistance need be apprehended, his message added, unless in the case of endeavoring to bring off prisoners or property, in which case there is no doubt our small force will be effectually overpowered. Archer appended a special appeal. I find a body of men, estimated at from 1,000 to 1,200, collected together with the avowed purpose of obstructing me in the execution of my duty, and I am entirely satisfied that the power of my county is not sufficient to enable me to execute the process. I therefore make application to your Excellency for such military service as the occasion demands. This time Governor Seward had no choice. The tenants themselves had forced his hand. Since only the state militia had the power to seize and occupy needed buildings, he ordered 3 uniformed companies to join Major Bloodgood at Clarksville. Some of the contingent left Albany at once, and 500 more were ordered from Montgomery County. In New York City, a steamboat waited under orders to embark troops at a moment's notice, and Philip Hone recorded in his diary, young men with muskets, unconscious yet of murderous lead, parade the streets panting for the fray, and anxious to flesh their maiden swords in Dutchman's blood. And many a one whose nose looks red this bright frosty morning may find it turned blue when he comes to poke it into the hostile camp of the belligerent Rensselaerwickers. But in truth and soberness, this is serious business. New York State was at war against the tenant farmers. Seward closeted himself in his office, where such close advisers as Thurlow Weed came and went throughout the night. At dawn, the governor emerged, tired and grave. Candles still burned on his desk, and the floor was littered with paper. To the waiting newspapermen, he handed copies of a personal appeal to be scattered broadside among the tenants. I appeal to all who have taken part in these unlawful proceedings to reflect upon their nature and consequences, and to remember that resistance to the officers of justice is a high misdemeanor, that when such resistance becomes concerted and organized, it is insurrection, and that if deaths ensue, the penalties of treason and murder are incurred, that the only lawful means to obtain relief from an injustice or redress of any grievances of which they complain are by application to the courts of justice and the legislature, and that they shall receive every facility which the executive department can afford in bringing their complaints before the legislature. I enjoin upon them, therefore, to desist from their opposition, and to conduct and demean themselves as orderly, peaceable, and well-disposed citizens, justly estimating the individual rights that they enjoy, and knowing that the only security for the preservation of their rights consists in the complete ascendancy of the laws. Quick to grasp the import of the governor's pledge, the leaders of the tenant army let the troops push on to Rensselaerville without opposition, while they called in Azor Tabor and Henry G. Wheaton, both able lawyers and members of Seward's party. Wheaton had just been elected to the legislature and was in a position to support them there, and Tabor was an influential Whig from a leasehold stock in Knox. On Thursday morning, December 12th, a messenger took Governor Seward the tenant's answer, set forth by Tabor and Wheaton. "We entertain no doubt," the intermediaries wrote, "that the utmost reliance may be placed upon their assurances, and that the pacific offers of your proclamation have been cordially embraced by those to whom it was chiefly directed." Virtually quoting from the governor's appeal, they pledged that the tenants would end hostilities, withdraw their army, and demean themselves as peaceable citizens, in the hope of securing justice by legal methods. As the troops prepared to leave Rensselaerville, Sheriff Archer sent further word to the governor that he could not find any of the persons against whom he had warrants. They had all disappeared when their comrades evacuated Reedsville. Their mission uncompleted, Archer's men began the homeward journey on Saturday. All day they plodded slowly across the cold, snow-cloaked Helderbergs and down the steep mountainside to Clarksville, where they encamped for the night. The next day they were off again at daybreak, wrapped in blankets and pushing their weary way through drifting snow for 12 miles. The bells were ringing for church when at last they reached the outskirts of Albany, where Governor Seward met them in a sleigh to thank them for their good conduct and patriotism. Without the loss of a drop of blood, Seward had taken the Helderbergs. He had saved the farmers from the brutalities of military occupation and the certainty of crushing defeat, yet had given no ground to the landed aristocracy. Thurlow Weed was sure the governor had taken a right and wise course, and the farmers themselves were confident that eventually the people of the state would vindicate their stand. The Democrats had hoped that the governor would blunder into political suicide by alienating the farmer support. Instead, he had increased his stature as their friend. Moreover, the march on the Helderbergs had catapulted the tenant struggle into national attention, and himself along with it. James Gordon Bennett, who made the New York Herald the most wicked and witty of papers, was inclined to feel that the landlord sympathizers had made fools of themselves. It was all right for the banks to suspend payment in 1837, he remarked editorially. It was always all right for bankers, financiers, and merchants to suspend debts, because they could always get the laws made to order. But for the ignorant, big-breeched Dutchmen of the hills to suspend paying their rents is a big crime to the noble Van Rensselaers. None but the educated, the refined, the financial, the brokers, the great commercial interests of society have a right to suspend their just debts. Bennett ridiculed the governor's appeal to the farmers as the Small Potato Proclamation and the tenant uprisings as the Small Potato War. He poked fun at former Governor Marcy and John Van Buren for having joined a sheriff's posse and then allowed themselves to be routed without a single shot. Finally, he published a malicious versified satire on the posse's expedition, which did not spare the feelings of either Marcy or Van Buren. Stephen Van Rensselaer and his friends, both Democrat and Whig, were worried and angry that the governor should have offered to use his high office on behalf of the farmers, and they lost no time in preparing for a legislative rejection. The doors of the Manor House were thrown open to politicians and lobbyists in an unparalleled round of Christmas festivity, as Stephen IV and his agents busied themselves anxiously with fence building. In the Argus, voice of the Albany Regency, editor Edwin Croswell accused Seward of acting with imbecility on the one hand and political demagogism on the other. He said that it was perfectly notorious that the sheriff had not brought the main body of his posse within 4 miles of the tenant army in the invasion of December 2nd, and it was therefore a matter of conjecture whether it could not have fulfilled its object. Even if the sending of troops the following week had been warranted, it had been needlessly expensive. The governor recommends, nay, appeals, to apply for redress to the legislature. We trust we shall not be accused of incendiarism if we inquire what the legislature can do. William H. Seward attempted to supply the answer in his 1840 message to the legislature in January. After congratulating the farmers for their cheerful and patriotic submission to the law, he then demanded immediate modification of the feudal leases. Even though the tenants had accepted them, as the Van Rensselaer lawyers pointed out, the state had an obligation to promote the general welfare, and the legislature had power over this, as well as all other forms of legal redress. Stephen IV asked indignantly by what right the governor questioned the justice of his claims or the wisdom of his vigorous enforcement. James Fenimore Cooper, also a landlord, recalled with nostalgia how readily John Jay had put the evil down when the Livingston tenants in Columbia County rose against their landlord. These Republican farmers, Cooper wrote contemptuously, had become so aristocratic that they did not want to be thought of as poulterers. He considered the relation between landlord and tenant entirely natural and salutary, and charged that Seward had taken his stand with the levelers solely because Stephen and William Van Rensselaer were only 2, while the disaffected tenants were probably 2,000. Despite protests from conservatives in both parties, Seward would not be swerved from his course. While the Senate was wrangling over the bill of $5,316.02 for the Helderberg War, Seward prodded the reluctant legislatures. True, he said, in organizing armed resistance, the farmers had chosen the wrong remedy for the evils of leasehold, yet it could not be denied that their complaints were well grounded. Their petitions for relief from tenures oppressive, anti-republican, and degrading are already before the legislature. I respectfully commend them to the favorable consideration of the Senate. The legislature was finally forced to set up a select committee to investigate the tenures. Late in March, the chairman reported that they too found the tenures contrary to good public policy. The quarter sale reservation, if rigidly enforced, would almost entirely prohibit transfer of title. The committee secured affidavits proving that the good patroon had induced poor and illiterate people to enter upon and cultivate the lands by promises which have not been fulfilled and by misrepresentations as to the nature of the leases. Exploring possible remedies, the committee found that a New York Supreme Court decision permitted the state to exercise the right of eminent domain to force the landlord to sell at a just price, provided the legislature deemed the benefit to the public of sufficient importance. A less drastic measure, giving partial relief, would be the elimination of the landlord's special remedies for distress. The committee recommended, however, that the state first try mediation. Accordingly, a bill was passed calling for the appointment of 2 commissioners to negotiate a settlement. Governor Seward promptly appointed as commissioners Gary V. Sackett and Hugh Maxwell, who had been president of the Whig Convention of 1838. The appointments provoked a storm of protest from the Democrats, who linked the move to the coming elections. The United States was in the grip of the wildest presidential campaign this country has ever known, in which a wealthy old Indian fighter named William Henry Harrison, hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, was being hailed as a poverty-stricken farmer, the log cabin and hard cider candidate. The picture was palpably false. but the Whigs only replied, "No matter, the prairies are on fire." The Democrats, struggling to re-elect Martin Van Buren, in spite of the slogans and parades and carnival spirit of the Whig campaign, insisted that Seward's whole plan was designed to create new officers to perambulate the manor and do service for the hard cider cause, and at the public expense. They were grieved to see more and more farmers cutting their Democratic ties to climb into wagons, hoist a coon high on a pole, and chant, "Van, Van is a used-up man." Moreover, Seward's friend Horace Greeley had returned to New York City to edit a Whig campaign paper, The Log Cabin, and a new verse had been added to the most popular of the campaign songs. "Who shall we have for governor, governor, governor? Who, tell me who? Let's have Bill Seward, for he's a team, for Tippecanoe and Tyler too, for Tippecanoe and Tyler too." Whether the two commissioners joined in the noisy summer campaign or not, they accomplished nothing for the farmers of West Manor that year, beyond a few preliminary conferences with tenants and representatives of Van Rensselaer. Meanwhile, the prairie fires swept Harrison and Tyler into the White House, and William H. Seward was returned to the governor's mansion, although by a much smaller majority. Early in January 1841, Maxwell and Sackett attempted to bring the landlord and the tenants together around a conference table. Stephen IV refused to participate, but he sent his attorney with his proposals. He was willing to retreat slightly from his 1839 position, but the only terms he offered were still contingent on full payment of back rent, and applied only to the 4 rebellious hill townships. The valley farmers could have their terms by applying individually at the manor house. Van Rensselaer also refused to give up the quarter sale, which the best lawyers in the state considered unconstitutional. Neither would he agree to the tenants' offer of a principal sum which would return interest equal to the rent, although Seward held it to be fair. Van Rensselaer argued that the farms had risen in value because of years of cultivation, and that he should receive a comparable increase. On the whole, the tenants were still disposed to compromise, but the patroon balked at every counter-proposal. James Fenimore Cooper stated the case for him. "This property is not only invested to his entire satisfaction, as regards conveniences, security, and returns, but also in a way that is connected with some of the best sentiments of his nature." Of Governor Seward, Cooper wrote,